Back at the garage, we have our new pads and rotors ready to install. To start, I need to back out the two 17mm bolts that hold the caliper to the rotor. I'm going to use my Ryobi impact to speed things along. Even with this being a California car, there was some rust on the brakes, so a mallet helped get the caliper off the rotor. With the caliper free, I don't want it hanging by the brake hose, it could do damage, so I create a support system out of zip ties and hang it from the suspension. With the caliper supported and out of the way, I can pull the brake rotor off. When installing new parts, I like to compare them side by side with the existing part to make sure there are no differences. Now that everything checks out, I'm going to hang the rotor back on the hub. Now it's time to start working on the caliper. I'm going to remove the rear retaining clip and two pins that sit inside the caliper and hold the brake pads in place. Like everything else in the brake system, these pins were pretty crusty and took a lot of work to get out. I'm going to do another quick check just to make sure everything looks good with the new parts. Now that we know all the new parts look good, we need to compress the piston in the caliper to make sure that we can get the brake pads all the way in and on the new rotor. With the piston and the caliper compressed, we need to line up the pads for the pin and clip installation. The pin and clip assembly was the reverse of the removal. My camera died without me noticing while doing the installation, so now we're skipping back to bolting the caliper onto the car. To reinstall the caliper, tighten the 17mm bolts to the German spec Gudentight. Now we're moving to the rear of the car, where I'm going to get underneath to get easier access to the caliper bolts. I'm using the same zip tie trick in the rear to hang the caliper and make sure I don't do any damage to the brake lines. Here's where things started to turn a little nasty. I'm going to use some editing magic here to skip, but essentially I backed off the inside emergency brake and had to put a lot of work in to get this rotor off. There is an M8 hole in the front of the rotor so you can thread a bolt in. That's how I really started to get movement to get the rotor off of the hub. Eventually, a large screwdriver gave me enough leverage to get the rotor off the hub. In the process of removing the rotor, I broke a small clip inside of the emergency brake drum. I ran to the hardware store and got a small bolt and managed to get it to retain at the same rate that the clip had. With the internal drum brake fixed, I can install the rotor. Anytime you install a new rotor, make sure you clean it up with brake clean. It'll remove any fingerprints, oils, and anything that the manufacturer might have put on there to preserve it. Just like with the front caliper, we have to remove the pins and clips that hold the pads in place. It's hard to see, but I actually had to hammer one of the pins out using a screwdriver. After spending way too much time on the rotors and pins, I was stoked when they were out. With everything out of the way, it's time to pry the pads out of the caliper. Just to be safe, I compare the old pads and the new pads after I pull them out of the packaging. The same as up front, I need to compress the piston so I can get the pads inside of the caliper. Don't forget to add the anti-squeal and anti-corrosion to the back of the pad. This will prevent rust and also will prevent any squeaks or rattles as the piston might rattle against the back of the pad. Doing one last quick brake clean just to get my fingerprints off. I'm going to get the caliper lined up and on and then install the pins and retaining clip. With the caliper all buttoned up, it's time to install it back on the car. Once that's finished up, I repeat on the other side. The brakes are done and looking good. Time to move on to the adapters. These are the 25mm hub-centric Faction Fab adapters I bought to go from 5x100 to 5x114.3. Since these are built for this car, installation was simple. Bolt the adapter to the hub using the supplied nuts and torque to factory spec. Once you do that on all four sides, it's time to install the wheels. I busted out my air impact to save some time after a pretty long day. Make sure you get them threaded on correctly before using any air tools. It's a good way to strip a stud. Two things to note here. My air gun is pretty weak, a professional one might damage the adapter, but I didn't have to worry about that. The second thing is to torque in a star pattern to make sure you seat the wheel correctly. I'm only showing the fronts, but I repeated front and rear. Now it's time to get the car off the jack stands. That's the rear on the ground. And the front's down too. Let's go torque the wheels to spec. The process here is straightforward. As always, torque in a star pattern to the factory spec. That's the whole car buttoned up. Let's go take her out for a ride, see if anything rubs or breaks. Whenever you install brakes, you don't want to be braking too hard. You want to kind of give them a chance any rattles, any squeaks. Car still goes straight. Everything feels good. New wheels feel good. Brakes feel good. Checked the oil before we left. It's been sitting, so it was a little above the top mark, but we'll check it again when we stop. Make sure it's not too much. I could always put it back up on ramps and crack the oil drain plug. All right, so that is the oil change finished, the brakes all the way around, pads and rotors finished, and the adapters, wheels, and tires all finished. So long weekend, car was up on jack stands. I'm glad it's done. And what did I learn? Learned a couple of things. The pin idea on Subaru brakes is great in theory. It's race car technology. It's pretty cool. Essentially, there's 2 pins right in the top that you pull out the top of the caliper. You can slide the brakes up and out. A lot of guys just take a pry bar in and compress the piston inside the caliper to then get room to move the new pads in, and that's sweet in theory, but after 15 years of being on a car, even one owner from California like this, they were stuck in place. I was trying not to use too many air tools, just hand tools to kind of, see how everything's done if you don't happen to have a compressor. It was what a pain. It added I think an hour pretty much on each side, so the brakes ended up taking me a while. The next thing I learned is about internal brake shoes. I've had cars with drum brakes. I've had cars with disc brakes. I've never had a car with an internal brake shoe, like a drum brake on the inside of the wheel caliper. It's nuts. I've never seen anything like it. So as you'll see, or as you saw, the rear brake took me forever to get off, and I did manage to break the drum. I realized that on the back there's an adjuster for this internal drum brake to essentially take it off, but even if this car was relatively new, it might not be a problem. But after a couple of years, you're going to get some corrosion in there. As the brake travels around in a circle, it's going to build some ridges, so it's going to be really hard to get it off. I learned that when installing wheels and tires, I knew there were directional tires. Obviously, I knew I had them picked out side to side. What I didn't realize is that the directional indicator had an arrow that looked like it was pointing forward when the actual sights, the area where the water siphons through the tires, were pointed the opposite way. So in the rears, I had them on wrong, so I had to flip them around before I took off. Another good thing I took away, it wasn't a mistake so much as just learning. I haven't had a Subaru before, so I obviously didn't really know about jack points. I don't love to jack on pinch welds or set a car on jack stands on pinch welds, but it's my first time getting it up in the air. One thing I noticed is there's a really good jack point and jack stand point under the front where the frame rails would be. I'm assuming it's the subframe under there. I should be able to jack it up and set it down up there. As a kid working on cars, I definitely destroyed a few pinch welds, so I try to stay away from them. And in the rear, where essentially a rear cross member would be, for the back of the car, there's a couple of good jack points and jack stand points under there too. So for the next time I take it up, when we do things like the exhaust and when I need to work on the engine, there's going to be a few things I need to do where I have to get under it again, and I've got better points to jack from and to set down on jack stands. Now let's go to the cardboard and cross off what we've done. So in the past weekend, we've gotten done wheels, tires, adapters, and I had written out front and rear brakes and brakes, so we'll just do brakes and squiggle these out. One thing I've been discussing with a few friends who are mechanics and have helped me through this is the sway bars. The factory sway bars aren't bad in this car, and for what I'm doing, they're not going to be noticeable, and for a modification that's almost $800, it's not worth it. I think the handling that I'm going to get from doing suspension and just keeping the factory sway bars, because I'm not going too low, I don't have to cut them out, it'll make it worthwhile. So what we're going to end up doing is canceling out the sways, and that'll free up some money for things that I did want to do that I wasn't sure I was going to have the cash for. Things like, the factory HIDs, maybe some really nice floor mats, like WeatherTechs, like you would want in a daily, basic things like that. So yeah, we're going to cancel that out and stick with Coilovers next. So the next thing you're gonna see me do is get this thing back up in the air. I can't wait. I'm gonna fix this front fender and I'm gonna do coilovers, and then we're gonna have to get an alignment for it. So I'll see if I can get a video of that. I'm not gonna do the alignment myself. It's not worth the money or the time. You know, it's, what is it, $100 for an alignment, and it would take me a day or two plus a couple $100 in tools. So we'll just go and have that done. After that, I've already picked up an exhaust and an intake. I've got an HKS exhaust and a K&N intake, so I'm really looking forward to putting those on. Then we need to do a little bit of engine work to delete those pumps and get the tune in, and then we'll be getting there. We'll be really getting there for the daily. After that, will be fun stuff like a short shifter and maybe some HIDs in the front, things like that. So thank you guys so much. That's brakes and wheels finished. Next time, tune in for a coilover install. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below.